Hi, welcome to my channel where we provide an alternative view to the common narrative. Today I'm going to talk a little bit more about personal aspects of the Battle of Bakhmut and what goes on in Ukraine. It's not a personal experience, it's more a story of how it is on the ground. So if you are interested, please continue watching. Welcome back. Today I'm going to try to provide some personal, not personal me, but I don't know how to express it differently in English, an experience or what is really happening in real life on the front, especially in Bakhmut. But before I begin, I just would like to mention that across the world there are many monuments to the unknown soldier. And I never understood what the meaning was of this unknown soldier until I actually watched a movie made in Finland, which is called The Unknown Soldier. And it is a war of normal people, normal soldiers on the Eastern Front between Finland and Russia during the Second World War. And at the end of the day is wars are fought by normal soldiers, people just like me and you. Names people that die and get injured, sacrifice themselves, etc., and which are never, the names are never known. We never know about them. We only always hear about generals and stuff like that. But it's the normal person, the unknown soldier, that basically fights the wars and dies. And basically, this is what one has to consider. Now, there are basically two stories for today. The one story is of Thomas Roper. He's a German blogger, journalist, if you want to call it, stationed in St. Petersburg. He has been living there, I believe, for about 15 years. He speaks Russian and he has regular podcasts. His main function is basically he translates English and Russian articles into German. And if you know German, you can read it. But if you read some of the English ones, you basically get the same information. His website is basically called, or his YouTube channel is called Anti-Spiegel. So if you want to listen and you understand German, you can join him. But in any case, he recently went to the Donbass front, or the Ukrainian-Russian conflict line, and made some videos about what they experienced there. Now, the first video he actually went there, or the first video he released, they actually went to with I think 2 Russians in a car to the so-called front. It's a small town. They never mentioned the name of the town, so I don't know where they really went. But according to him, it was about 250 meters from the front line. But there were the town was quiet. There were no shooting or artillery. So just from that point of view, one has to think that the front lines or the war is not fought in a similar manner as, say, World War I or even as World War II. There is no predefined or fixed line of, or no man's land, if you want to call it. Basically, the front line is fluid and it all depends on where the concentrations of enemy power, enemy armament and the enemy is. And in this small town, they talked to 2 families actually. And in this 2 family, there was one boy that was about 8 years old. And effectively, this town was always part of the front since 2014. So this boy was born in war and experienced his whole life war as per se. Now, when I talked to him, there was no fear in him. He basically created his own type of shelter, helmet, military vest, and so on. And for him, basically, it was a game. And when I talked to him about this, why don't you leave? Or to his parents, he said they did leave at one stage, but when they went to the city, they felt that it wasn't their home. So what were they doing there? And they decided they would feel much more comfortable in their own home, in spite of the war going on. But because it's not a fixed line of, say, of a battle or a fixed front, sometimes they were shelled. You can see some of that. It's a small, very small town, maybe cluster of about 20 houses or so, maybe more, maybe 50 houses. And some of them were damaged, and some of them they were empty, and some of them people still lived as if it's a normal life. And then they would either get support from the Ukrainians, or they would get some support from the Russians in terms of water and rationing and food and stuff like that. But they didn't mind living under those conditions. The boy even had picked up some shell casings, and so forth. So he had a range of used ammunition. And, well, if you think about it, an 8-year boy who was very mature in that respect was quite normal. He was quite acceptable. They were not afraid of anything. He played outside, was very friendly, gave most of the times when the Russian soldiers would come by, he would give them presents, even if they didn't have much themselves, and so forth. And then they went on and they talked to a small girl, also about 7 years old, very nice people. Mother stayed there, asked the same questions, and they again said, why should they leave? And they have been experiencing this type of war since 2014. So if you think about your life as it is currently, and if you can think about how these people are living under constant threat of life, then it's quite an amazing. Any case, so that video wasn't that long, but when I went back to the barracks, the one soldier, the Russian soldier, gave him basically, he called it a safety talk. And the reason why I'm actually mentioning is that because the Russian soldier explained to him that this is an artillery war, pure and simple, pure artillery war. And what should he do if there is attack? And he said, firstly, that if you hear an explosion, the first thing you must do is you must hit the ground and lie as flat as possible. Because apparently, the shrapnel of these ammunitions, 90% of that flies just about the knee height. And he also told Thomas that the worst thing he can do is that once the explosion has occurred, to lift his head, because the shrapnel still travels for about between 2 and 3 seconds after the explosion. And unfortunately, he has lost friends and civilians because they were not heeding the instructions, and basically got killed when they lifted their head after the explosion, trying to look out where was the explosion. So one of the rules he explained was to, first thing is hit the ground, bury your face in the ground or any hollow piece, and then keep it low. And if you see any other water pool or a slow indentation in the soil or sloot, trench, small trench or small excavation, then try to crawl at it as low as possible without lifting your head and get into that type of, call it, indentation in the soil. And if you can do that, then he will survive that explosion by about 98%. The chances for survival. He also said that once the explosion has happened, and after, say, 5 minutes, 5 seconds, he shouldn't start to run. because the next salvo can come in at any time, and then that's it. So if he sees any shelter, basement, and so on, he should slowly creep to that station. And even if the explosion totally dies down, he has to lie in that position for at least, or remain in that shelter, or lie in that position for at least, say, 30 minutes. Because sometimes the shelling would stop, then for 14, 15 minutes there will be quietness, and that's when people usually stand up and try to walk to shelter, and then the next bombardment starts. And he explains is that because it's artillery war, there's counter battery fire, and every after initial amount of artillery shells were fired, they have to move positions, and that happens on the Ukrainian side and on the Russian side, and that takes about between 14 and 15 minutes to get into a new position, and then they fire on top of the same location, the coordinates that they had fired previously, because that is the fire instruction. So nothing happens, you don't expose, even if the artillery stops firing and the explosions stop, for at least 30 minutes thereafter. Because after 30 minutes, it is sort of 100% sure that the specific artillery unit has completed its fire mission, and that they will now stop and probably move to a new position and to bombard a new position. So this was a clear indication on how this whole, or explanation of how the whole artillery warfare is progressing and how it is done, and what one should actually look after. So I was hoping that it gives you some insight on which these people are living. In any case, the main personal reason, well, the main story I wanted to actually tell about was a story that was published in The Guardian about a father and son who was on the Ukrainian side, who basically joined the fight against the Russians. Now, the father was called Viktor Shutlik, and he was the headmaster of a very small school in Popasna, which is part of Lugansk, and is about 30 minutes drive from Bakhmut. Now, that was still under Ukraine. He lived in the town which was basically under Ukrainian control. Since 2014, they were basically part of the front line. Well, during the last 8 years and so on, the school was basically bombarded twice and destroyed, but it was repaired by donations and by the Ukrainian government. And Victor also had 3 daughters that were both old teachers. His wife was also a teacher at the school. And his son, let me just get his name, Denise, was also a PT trainer at the school. So it seems to me the whole family was involved. They basically also, when the SMO started in February 2000, or last year 21, nobody in the family really understood what was going on, and they couldn't understand what was happening. Now, Victor was also a history teacher, and based on his history teacher, he basically thought that the Russians were repeating the attack on the Ukraine, and that they came there to destroy them. And they didn't see the Russians as liberators. They lived also on the 8th floor of a building, and again, the daughters, they wanted to evacuate them, the Ukrainians, but Victor basically refused, but his daughters did go away, probably under the instruction of their husbands. And Victor and his wife and his son stayed back. And the shelling continued at the beginning of February, and then they decided that was a little bit bad, and they moved back. They moved to Bakhmut, or they went to Bakhmut and tried to find some shelter there. Then on March last year, March the 6th of last year, Victor and his son Denis joined the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Force. That's the Territorial Defense Force. As well, about 16 of his former pupils joined the army. Now, the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Force consists of civilians who had no military training. They were typically teachers, accountants, mechanics, and whatever type of general profession they had. And the Territorial Defense Force was actually there to man checkpoints and other stationary positions. But unfortunately, in June last year, the law was changed, and the Territorial Defense Force could be deployed on the front line itself, because it seems to me there was a boost of manpower requirement, and Ukraine forced these guys to go on the front. But now remember, these guys have no combat experience. They were not in the army. So basically, you could see them as effective cannon fodder unless they went underwent the necessary training. We all know, and we have all been talking about Bakhmut. Well, not me so much, because for me it's more a battle, but a serious battle, an important one, but not for the reason that this general talked about. In any case, so this battle should have happened for maybe a month or 2 months, and that would have been not the end for the fighting of Victor and Denis, but basically it wouldn't have been so severe, and they didn't think it would be that critical. But we all know at this stage better. It's now been going on for more than 6 months, and it was a war of attrition, artillery fire, and that is the core essence of this battle. But they were also instructed not to allow, although it was supposed to be a fairly mild battle going on, a mild conflict. Later on, they were told, and we also have been informed many times by Zelensky, that Bakhmut was important and that they will not retreat. And they basically were instructed not to let the Russians go any further and take over the city. And also that they had to protect the other cities a little bit further away, like Charkiv, Yar, Konstantinivka, and Kramatorsk. Well, there's so many stories about Bakhmut, so that we don't really know much about, except in this case, we have a little bit of on-hands type of knowledge or information. And this was basically conveyed by Victor and Denis to the Guardian reporter at the beginning of shortly after they arrived in Bakhmut and were on the front line. Now, these guys had no support or ability to mount any counteroffensive, and due to this, a lot of Ukrainians actually have died in order to defend the city. This was basically happening in muddy trenches and bombed out houses and I just said it. Basements. Also, because they were territorial defense units, they did not have all the equipment that they needed. They didn't have the protection of artillery. They didn't have the protection of armor. They barely had the basic necessary in terms of rifles, ammunition, and so on to fight the battle. And that was about it. So it doesn't seem like the Ukrainian military considered them of high value and strategic forces, and basically put them into a position where they could easily be killed. or maimed. In any case, so the story goes like that. In October last year, the 6th, Victor and Denise were sent to a factory on the outskirts of Bakhmut, which was only a few hundred meters away from the Russian forces. And they were told to hold this position for about 3 days until replacements would have arrived. And they were dropped off about 7 p.m. in the evening or the afternoon. And soon it was very dark. And then they were told to search the factory and collect any bodies they found, which they did. And then they were told to collect the bodies beyond the factory's limits, even closer to the enemy lines. But by that time, it was dark and they were using the moonlight to guide them. And then the Russians spotted them and opened fire with artillery. Not small fire, artillery. And then they abandoned these bodies, which was 3 Ukrainians and 1 Russian, and they took cover back in the factory's basement. And then they were instructed then they were re-instructed to go and collect these bodies, but they said they refused to do that because they couldn't see and they were spotted by the Russians, and they will go the next morning when it was a little bit late, when it was more light. And then his father said, actually Victor, said that if we get out of here, it will be a miracle. That were the words they used. And the next morning, the Russians started firing again, and an artillery round hit the door of the basement. And this caused a fire, and naturally panic, and people tried to press wet cloth against their mouth to breathe through in order not to inhale the smoke. And they tried to find a way out of the basement. And his father, according to Denise, was in the middle of the basement at the moment. And he was more like to the edge of the basement. And, well, they tried to escape, but he couldn't find his father. When he went back to the basement, he did find his father, but he was covered by another man's body. But his father was still alive. So he pulled him to the entrance of the basement, and apparently there was also some ammunition stored in the basement, and this started to explode or to detonate. And no, not in the basement, it was in the factory. In any case, he still tried to pull his father out, but he couldn't do it because of the explosion of the ammunition, the stored ammunition. At that stage, the Russian artillery fire has stopped, but basically he couldn't do it. And he had to, I think he was also injured, Denise. And at that stage, basically the entire group that he was with was either dead or wounded, which would even include his father. And when he went back, he did find his father, and basically his father has died in the meantime. So they didn't see much of the enemy. They were mostly instructed to recover some corpses of fallen soldiers. The main armament or the main experience they had of the war was mostly artillery. There was no shooting, small fire shooting. And went in, sat in the basement, waited, were bombarded, were spotted, were bombarded, had to move out. Most of them were killed or wounded for no purpose. So what defense did they actually do? In any case, while he was leaving again, he was wounded again, and then he tried to went into a small ditch. But the second injury wasn't that severe, so they rescued him, and he could get back to his base. And in his base there was another territorial defense force, and they gave him administered first aid, and then all the wounded were sort of evacuated. etc. And at this stage, there was a drone flying above them, and that could be seen and spotted them, and that resulted in the continuation of the artillery bombardment by the Russians. And that is what they had sort of lived. Now, there's some more basically stories and so on, like the son that phoned his mother, and told her that his father has died, and the emotional reaction that went with that, and unbelief that it will happen. But, I mean, it was more or less expected. War is war, and war is terrible, and people die. So, now yeah, that is how it goes. But in any case, he also said that right after this incident, where Victor's and Delay's territorial defense force were basically SWAT with another territorial defense force of Poltava, a region in the central and eastern Ukraine, which hasn't seen a lot of fighting. And within a day, 200 out of the 500 Poltava units were injured. And again, for what purpose? Did they fight the Russians? No. So what was the purpose of their mission? I don't know. What was the casual rate? Well, 200 out of 400 or 500. And that was within a day. As you can see, this is no... and when they got there, and they asked the nice guys, lads, give us some advice, anything, what to do, how to hide. And then the nice told them, but there was nothing they can do. All you can do is fall into the trenches, and hopefully your fate will decide what will happen. If there's a direct hit inside the trenches, then that is how it goes. But the trenches do protect you to a certain extent to artillery fire. In any case, when his father died, well, that was unfortunately funerary, but the Nice had to stay because the law says that any territorial defense force member that has been taken up and so on has to fight until the end of the war, and the Nice was basically sent back to the front. And unfortunately, there is no more. That's the story that was published. I don't think there was any follow-up, and I don't think that the Guardian ever found him again to do another interview. And that was more like a personal story. Now, once, in one of my previous videos, I also talked about the experience of an American volunteer that went to Ukraine, had basically no military experience, and how they were basically sent as volunteers to Mariupol, and then the helicopters were shut down, and then later on he went on some couple of missions with APCs, and they were, as soon as they came to a certain spot, they were attacked, and most of the crew was killed. He luckily survived. And in the third attack, again, they were trying to go to, I think it was Bakhmut. And when they neared Bakhmut, they came under artillery fire, and again, a lot of his comrades were killed. So it's all, for me, it's all, I don't know, it's not like a war, it's a war. If you don't see the enemy, then how can you fight a war? And we've been told constantly it's an artillery war. Now, if the Ukrainians have 10 cannons and the Russians have 100 cannons, then surely you cannot even contemplate or expect a win. And what I don't understand is that Bakhmut is not a big town. It's supposed to have about 70,000 pre-war inhabitants. And it was flattened by artillery fire. So what you should have done if you're Ukrainians, you should have declared basically Bakhmut as a no man's zone. You should have kept your troops on the outskirts of Bakhmut. trying to have maybe some small of advanced observation points. So should the Russian soldiers advance, then you can direct artillery fire. But that's about it. In that time, you should have maybe had 30 guys as observation points, spread over the whole city, hiding and just not becoming target of Russian artillery fire. And that should have been sufficient. So I'm not sure why you need 100 men or 30 men in the basement of one building. What are you going to do with them? So it sort of basically it amazes me a little bit and how the Ukrainians thought about this whole matter. Anyway, guys, that's my story for today. Until next time, cheers.